Hi guys, Dr. J here, and in this video we're going to start talking about airspace, controlled and uncontrolled airspace, categories of airspace, how to recognize and identify the different kinds of airspace on aeronautical charts, and how it all relates to flying small UASs. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. The sources of information for airspace is going to be PHAC Chapter 15, the Remote Pilot SUAS Study Guide Chapter 2, and the ACS Section 2 on airspace. So classes of airspace. This is a bit of a complicated topic. There's lots of different kinds of airspace, and a lot of it is specific to different airports and things like that. Just in general, in this set of videos that I'll do, we'll be going over the definitions of airspace, controlled and uncontrolled airspace. I'll kind of give you an introduction today, and we'll begin to talk about different classes of airspace. And then probably in a separate video, we'll do other types of controlled airspace, as well as different other types of things where flight is controlled or restricted, such as temporary flight restrictions, other types of flight zones or no-fly zones. How's this going to help you as a drone pilot? It's going to help you avoid manned aircraft. So again, this is going to be mostly related to operations in and around airports, although that's not always the case. There's going to be a number of other types of airspace that you're going to want to be aware of that are not in and around airports. So you'll want to be able to look at a chart, identify the type of airspace that you're near or that you'll be flying inside or near of, and you'll want to be able to decide what needs to happen. Do you need to get authorization from air traffic control using the FAA Drone Zone website, for example? Do you need to contact some other controlling agency? So this is what this airspace lecture or series of videos is going to help you understand. The primary purpose of control airspace is to prevent collisions between aircraft, that should say. Let me fix that right now. Aircraft, not airspace. And of course, to keep everyone who's flying and on the ground underneath safe from accidents. And this topic of airspace is going to be very closely related to charts, which are going to be covered in the next module, but we'll talk about that some today as well. It's important to remember that nearly all of the existing infrastructure, regulations, services that are related to flight and airspace were designed over the last century for manned flight, not drones, not small UASs. So some of the regulations are going to be very pertinent for manned aircraft, are not going to seem so relevant or important maybe for unmanned aircraft. But two things I'll say about that is, number one, these topics will be on the Part 107 knowledge exam. They'll be covered there, and there'll be different questions about different types of airspace and identifying airspace on the charts and so forth. And you'll want to be able to know that information to pass the Part 107 exam. The second thing is that these different classifications of airspace are going to be very familiar to manned aircraft pilots, and you're going to want to be aware of that as well, so that you know when you're operating near certain types of airspace, what are the other manned aircraft that are likely to be around that area. Okay, so let's start out with some introduction. Controlled airspace is airspace where air traffic control provides a service. For example, landing organization at an airport. So you've got a bunch of planes that need to land. Air traffic control provides this organizational service, different types of services in controlled airspace. And there are other types of airspace that are regulated or restricted in some way, but don't necessarily provide an air traffic control service. And we'll cover those in this module, but not necessarily in this lecture. So here again is the chart that I showed at the beginning. Controlled airspace is specific regions around airports where air traffic control authorization is required to fly. And this is true not just for unmanned aircraft pilots, but also for manned aircraft pilots, in particular Class A and Class B airspace. If you're a manned aircraft pilot, you're going to be getting authorization to enter into those zones. And you can see there's kind of some different shapes to these classes. Class A is above 18,000 feet mean sea level. That's going to be high altitude aircraft, usually larger aircraft, very little drone operations in that area. And then Class B is going to be, you can see the biggest kind of controlled airspace. Class C and D are going to be smaller. And we'll talk about all these classes in more details. And of course, you're going to need clearance to fly an unmanned aerial vehicle in these airspaces. And I have a little asterisk there saying most of the time. In some cases, Class G airspace, you won't necessarily need clearance. It's just going to depend in some cases. There is uncontrolled airspace, and this is where no services are provided and no clearance is required. And this is, as I mentioned just a moment ago, Class G. Class Gulf airspace is the class of airspace where you are allowed to fly without any clearance or authorization. So this is essentially the place where most unmanned flights are going to be taking place. There are special use airspaces, and these are typically going to be related to government purposes. These are going to include military operating areas, controlled firing areas, alert areas, and various other types of prohibited or restricted areas. These areas, these special use airspace areas, are in general, you're going to want to avoid those, but in some cases, you can fly a UAS in those areas. For example, military operating area, you will be able to fly a UAS in those areas under, as long as there's no special activities going on. And in some cases, even in restricted areas, you can request authorization from the controlling body. There are other types of airspace, such as wilderness areas. For example, flying at national parks with unmanned vehicles is prohibited without authorization from the National Park Service. And there's going to be other things like temporary flight restrictions. For example, if the Super Bowl's in town, or a major football game, another sports event, and other types of areas as well. National security areas, special flight rules areas, terminal radar service areas, different types of areas. We're going to talk about all these, and you'll be able to identify these on the charts when we talk about that particular topics. So just before we get started into the details of the actual airspace classifications themselves, wanted to define a couple of these terms again. I know we've talked about these before. AGL, above ground level, and MSL or ASL, mean sea level or above mean sea level. These are going to be two terms that are going to be used for different types of airspace. And so I mentioned, for example, Class A airspace starts at 18,000 feet, and that's 18,000 feet above mean sea level. So it's going to be 18,000 feet MSL. Now, if you're talking about, let's say, Class Gulf airspace, that's going to be generally ending at 1,200 feet AGL. So 1,200 feet above ground level is where Class Gulf airspace ends. Class Echo airspace begins. So these terms you're just going to want to keep in your mind. And again, the difference here between AGL and MSL or ASL is just going to be the elevation of the point on the ground where you happen to be standing. And if the elevation is changing, the AGL height is also going to be changing. But the MSL level, for example, in this case, here is a constant MSL height or ASL height. But the AGL is changing depending on where you are on the ground. So over here, near the coastline, ASL is almost equal to AGL. And over here, up on this hilltop, ASL could be significantly less than mean sea level. And that's going to be true pretty much for all of the slides that we'll show here in the next few minutes. So for example, the Denver airport sits a mile. The elevation of Denver is about a mile above sea level. And so that you'll have to take that into account when you're looking at numbers. So the numbers on the aeronautical charts are going to be reported in mean sea level, MSL, but you'll want to keep in mind that, for example, certain types of airspace are going to end so many feet above ground level. So if the aeronautical chart says 1,200 feet mean sea level, you're going to want to know how high is that actually above ground level. Okay, so let's keep going here. Charts are going to be written, this is what I've just mentioned, charts are going to be written using mean sea level, but the flight restrictions, for example, for a drone, you can't fly higher than 400 feet above ground level, AGL. You may have to do some math in your head on the fly when you're looking at these charts and trying to decide how high you're able to fly, but we'll talk more about how to do that as we go along. A few other rules, visual flight rules, or also sometimes called visual flight rating, VFR, versus IFR, instrument flight rules or rating. Visual flight rules are you have to be able to see the ground and have reference to the ground during flight. So this would be, for example, if you're just starting out getting your manned aircraft pilot license, you would be flying using visual flight rules. Commercial airlines that are flying above 18,000 feet and that are flying through clouds and things like that, they're going to be using instrument flight rules, which means you can use instruments by themselves to fly without being able to see the ground or even necessarily see around you. So those are just two terms, VFR and IFR. And then kind of something related for our purposes, visual meteorological conditions, conditions under which VFR flight is possible. And of course, also instrument flight rating is also possible if VFR is possible. This is the kind of conditions, visual meteorological conditions, or VMC, that we're going to be operating in as UAS pilots. So we have to be able to see our drones, for example. Compare that with instrument meteorological conditions, IMC. This is conditions under which only instrument flight rules or instrument flight rating is possible. So this is not going to be when we are operating our UASs, because we cannot fly in under these conditions. So you as a UAS pilot may fly in visual meteorological conditions, VMC, but you're not allowed to fly in instrument conditions. In other words, UAS pilots, there's currently no instrument rating for UAS pilots. You have to have a special waiver to fly under those conditions, and that would be something that you'd have to get special permission from the FAA to do.